Hello everyone, this is a detailed analysis of Geoffrey Chaucer's general prologue to the Canterbury Tales. The Canterbury Tales was written towards the end of Chaucer's career, and it is the book that marked the beginning of modern English literature, just before the Renaissance period. The general prologue discusses the context of the Canterbury Tales, or the frame narrative, which is modelled on Boccaccio's Decameron, and it presents the characters meeting at Tabardin and going to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury. These characters are all described representing a portrait gallery of 14th century England. After the general prologue, the tales told by the pilgrims are presented with an individual prologue each. The general prologue opens in spring, in April. The narrator says, "When the sweet showers of April have pierced the dry soil of March down to the roots." March is dry season, and spring is just beginning at that time. In April, there will be rain that soaks the dry soil of March at that time, when the west wind or Zephyrus has inspired flowers to grow everywhere. In spring, there are flowers everywhere. When the constellation Aries, the ram, which is associated with spring, appears in the sky and birds begin to sing. Everywhere there is joy, new birth, hope. At this time, people do not want to stay indoors. They choose to go on pilgrimages to other countries. However, in England, many visit the shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury. Likewise, our narrator is also desirous of visiting the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, and he has come to Tabard Inn in Southwark. This is the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. Magnificent, isn't it? This is where the narrator wants to go. So, he is one day sitting at Tabard Inn in Southwark, and he's on his way to Canterbury, and a diverse group of 29 pilgrims arrive there. There were enough rooms and stables at the Tabard Inn for them all. So that night they stay there. And the narrator spoke to all of them. He got to know all of them, made friends with them, and they made plans to get up early next day and go on their journey together. So they have decided to go the next day on the journey to Canterbury together. And the narrator says, "Now I will tell you about the pilgrims, what I understood of them, before I tell you the tales that they told." This is a drawing in the manuscript of the narrator Chaucer. The first character that the narrator describes is the knight. The narrator says, "There was a worthy knight who was very chivalrous." Chivalry is the code of conduct of knights in the medieval period. And from the very beginning of his adventures, the knight has loved truth, honor, freedom, and courtesy. These are chivalric values. The knight has loved chivalric values like truth, honor, freedom, and courtesy. He has fought many wars for his lord, that might mean the king or Christ. He has fought many wars in Christendom, not only in Christendom or Europe or the Christian world, but also in the heathen countries, that means Middle East. The knight has fought wars in Europe as well as Middle East, and wherever he went, he was honored everywhere for his bravery. The narrator recounts the knight's victories in Alexandria, Prussia. Prus is the word he uses for it. Lithuania or Latvia. Lato is the word. Russia or Rus. The siege of Algeciras in Granada in Spain. Then he talks about the place Belmari, Ayaz in Armenia, Atalia or Antalya in Turkey, Chaucer is talking about all these different places because he himself is a diplomat. He is also showing that he knows, not the narrator, I mean the author. The author is showing that he knows the entire Europe. And this is the time of the Crusades, when the Christians of Europe are fighting in different parts of Europe and the Middle East with the pagans. So these battles that the knight waged were mostly against the pagan Moors. The knight's character next. The knight has fought 15 battles in the Mediterranean region. Chaucer mentions the Mediterranean in order to preserve Christian faith. He has fought 3 battles, especially in Trasimene in Algeria. And note it, he never lost a single battle. The knight has fought, says Chaucer, with Lord Palatai against the heathen king of Turkey. Remember, in the general prologue, there are a lot of names of places and names of kings and people mentioned. And there are many lists. List of foods, list of things, list of virtues. So many lists are there throughout the general prologue. Though the knight won sovereign prizes wherever he went, and he was also noble, he was wise, and he was meek as a maid. That is actually a chivalric value. To be meek, polite, gentle, kind. The knight cannot suffer the tales of people's sufferings. That is said in his own individual prologue. So he is a true chivalrous knight. In his life, he never said vile things about others. Note this, because there are many lower class characters in Canterbury Tales who gossip and tell tales about others. The knight is very high class, and he shows that standard of character. He will never say vile things about others. And Chaucer says he was a very parfit gentle knight. Verray means truly very parfit gentle knight. Now the narrator goes on to talk about knight's clothes. You must know that Chaucer talks about the clothing of his characters quite a lot. Chaucer himself was the customs officer, and he knew the fashions and the clothing that came from other countries into England. And he uses the theory of physiognomy, or appearance determining character. Clothes will determine the person's character. Chaucer says, now to tell you about his clothes. Remember, he's always speaking in a very conversational style. And there are lots of connecting phrases that he uses, conversational phrases that he uses. This establishes a relationship between the narrator and the audience or the readers. So the narrator says, now to tell you about the knight's clothes. His horse was of fine quality, but he did not wear gaudy clothes. Well, he did not compromise on his horse, but his clothes were all like a poor man's clothes. He wore a thick, hard-wearing cotton shirt, fustian jupon. Fustian is the type of cloth. In the general prologue, Chaucer talks about a variety of clothes and material, textile material. Jupon is the shirt that he wears. That is the word for shirt. And his shirt was discolored or stained by his chain armor. Habergeon, that is the word for knight's armor that he is giving. Remember, in the exam, they might ask you some line, a quotation from Chaucer's own language. And then, if you know some important words, with these words you will be able to identify who he is talking about, who the narrator is talking about. In the quotation, who is referred to, you will be able to understand. The knight is still wearing his armor. He has not taken it off because he has just returned from his voyage and he is now going on his pilgrimage. This is the picture of the knight. This is also from a drawing made by some scribe in a manuscript. There are also woodcuts made of this in the 19th century. The squire is the knight's son. The knight, squire, and the yeoman are a household group, and they have come together. They were the first people to come after Chaucer came. The knight is the father of the squire. Both of them are chivalrous. With the knight, his son, the squire. The squire, the word meaning is knight's assistant. Like a guest lecturer, a squire is a knight's assistant. The squire was also there. He was a lover and a lusty bachelor. Well, these words do not have these are the words of Chaucer, but these words do not have the contemporary meaning. If they had the contemporary meaning, this will be like an insult to say the first thing to say about the squire is that he is a lover and a lusty bachelor. Actually, in the medieval period, it means that he is a gentle, happy young man. He is a gentle, happy young man of about 20, and he had curly hair. The squire's curly hair is indicative of his lasciviousness or lustfulness, actually. And his hair looked as if it has been pressed. If you press straight hair with a hot iron, it will curl. So it looked as if the squire has fashionably, artificially curled his hair. The squire was of average height and was wonderfully active, a man of great strength. He was very athletic, well-built, healthy. He had served in the cavalry or horseman army. Chivachi, that is the word that Chaucer uses. He has gone to Flanders, Artois, Picardy. So the squire is widely travelled. And he did wherever he went and fought. He did well wherever he went. With his exploits, the squire hoped to win his lady love. The squire is in love and he is desperate to win his lady love, says the narrator. The squire is also very youthful. He wore a colourful shirt. Embroidered was he. That is the words used by Chaucer. He wore a colourful shirt that looked like a meadow of white and red fresh flowers. The squire's shirt looked like a meadow with fresh flowers. He always sang or played the flute and was as fresh as the month of May. Very famous, this phrase. He wore a short gown with long and wide sleeves and rode his horse well. A short gown with long and wide sleeves and rode his horse well. He could make songs. He was good at making poetry. He could joust. Jousting is like fencing with a sharp needle-like sword. He could dance. He could sketch. He could write. He was a gentleman with all the gentlemanly skills. So hot he loved. Well, hot also does not have its contemporary meaning. So intensely he loved. So well he loved that he slept no more than a nightingale does. The knight also spends sleepless nights. The squire also spends sleepless nights. Actually, this is like making a little fun of the over-earnestness of both father and son. There is a little bit of very subtle humor here. Remember, all the interpretations are not actually said in the text. The general prologue is more about what is between the lines, what is not said. A lot of meanings in the general prologue are very subtle. They are not stated very clearly. Interpretation of critics has made us understand that these meanings are also there. That is the greatness of the general prologue, that it doesn't state everything clearly. There's a lot of understatement and subtlety and ambiguity. The squire was courteous, humble. The word that Chaucer uses for humble is lowly. That word is repeatedly used several times in several persons' descriptions. The squire was courteous, humble, and willing to serve or serviceable. That is a chivalric value. And he carved before his father. He carved the meat for his father at the table. That means he served his father. This is an indication that the squire is becoming almost as good as his father. And his father must be very proud of him. This is the picture of the squire, young man of 20. Next, we'll talk about the yeoman who accompanied the knight and the squire. The knight had a yeoman and no other servants. The knight must have been a very rich man, but he lived a very frugal life. He did not have many servants. Whereas lower class characters and the professional class characters have servants. The yeoman was pleased to travel. He likes to travel. He wore a coat and hood of green. Later on, Chaucer says that he was a forester. His coat and hood of green probably indicates his being close to nature, because he is also a peasant. And he fights for his master, so he carries many weapons. The yeoman carried a mighty bow and some sharp and bright peacock feather arrows under his belt. Peacock feather arrows is also exotic, and it is not usual common arrows, because yeoman works for the knight. His arrows are very rare and beautiful also. He had a cropped head and a brown face. Very practical people in the Canterbury Tales have cropped heads. He had a cropped head and a brown face. Very smart guy. And he knew the practice of woodcraft. Remember that woodcraft or carpentry was a very common craft and art in that time. It has also Christian connotations, because Christ also was a carpenter. And in the West, a lot of ordinary people knew carpentry, because it was by themselves that they made furniture, I suppose. They did not buy furniture or anything. And another thing that was very common in the West, if you are a learned man, would be law. Most people studied law. So, yeoman knew the practice of woodcraft. He wore an archer's brace on his wrist. Because he was a fighter, he wore an archer's brace. And on one side of his body hung a sword and a shield. Buckler or shield. And the other side, he had an ornamented dagger. The dagger was ornamented. And our yeoman wore a medal on his breast, like a locket, which is the medal of Saint Christopher. And he also carried a horn, because for warriors and hunters there will be a horn. He carried a horn with a green strap. That also has a green strap. The narrator thinks that the yeoman is a real forester. Next, the prioress. There was a prioress called Madame Eglantine. Eglantine is the name of a flower. It means sweet briar or sweet rose. Now, a prioress is a head of a convent. She is an ecclesiastical woman, clergy woman, and she is not supposed to have the name of a sweet flower. Instead, she should have the name of some saint. But our Eglantine or prioress is secretly amorous. She simply smiled. She smiled simply and modestly. And the next thing that Chaucer says is that she swore mildly. Hello, the prioress is not allowed to soar at all. She is not supposed to swear. She is not supposed to swear at all. But our prioress swore mildly by Saint Loy. The prioress does not say very harsh words. She does not remember anybody's mother, but she swore mildly by Saint Loy. And she sang her divine service in a nasal tone. Nasal tone means polite. It also means stylish. At that time in Chaucer's age, the language was changing. The great vowel shift was going to happen. A lot of upper class characters towards the beginning of the Renaissance, a lot of upper class characters began to speak English and peasants' language, and the peasants also became a little more powerful because of peasants' revolt, etc. So there was an interim language that was forming, and the prioress's language might show this. She spoke in a very stylish nasal language, nasal tone. She also spoke French elegantly, but with a Stratford at the Bow accent. Stratford at the Bow is probably where her convent was. The next line that Chaucer says is she did not know Parisian English. Parisian French. Parisian French was unknown to her. So she spoke the fashionable Stratford accent of French. Well, I think it is like you speak the Mumbai English. To speak London English is, of course, very high and good. But local people, rural people, etc., if they go to Mumbai, they will start speaking English with some Hindi words, Mumbai words thrown in between. That is also fashionable. Like that. That she spoke Stratford French means that she is educated. She is from uh, Stratford Convent. Now, the prioress acted like a lady and she had very good table manners. She let not a single morsel fall from her lips. When we eat food, half of it will go into the mouth, half of it will fall back into the plate. The prioress is not like that. She let no morsel fall from her lips. She did not wet her finger too deep in the sauce. It is not like we South Indians eat rice. We will crush rice with our palm and eat it with making it into a gooey paste. That is not how the prioress eats. She does not wet her finger too deep in the sauce so that she does not have to wash her hands, And she wiped her lip clean every time she ate the meat so that she will not grease her cup. Otherwise, when you drink from the cup, there will be a lot of grease on the cup. And she reached for her food in a very becoming manner, in a very, gentle and upper class manner without showing any greed. Now, the prioress's character. Note that some characters like the prioress, friar, etc. are described in very great detail, while some other characters are not so much described. Why Chaucer is describing some characters in detail and what language he uses and where he focuses when describing a character, etc., show the nature of Chaucer's own character in a very, very subtle manner. Like in a dramatic monologue, the character of the speaker is revealed inadvertently. Like that in the general prologue, the character of the speaker is also revealed inadvertently. The prioress had a pleasant character and took great care to imitate the manners of courtiers and to appear dignified and respectable. Here, Chaucer is making fun of the pretentious clergy, high clergy. He is also making fun of the pretentious upper classes, the aristocrats. The prioress took great care to appear dignified and charitable and respectable. She was so charitable and compassionate that she would weep at the sight of a mouse caught in a trap. Whether the mouse is dead or bleeding, even if the mouse is dead, she will cry. Chaucer keeps talking about how she cries at a mouse and how she takes care of her dogs. And actually, subtly, he's telling us that she doesn't care for human beings. The prioress lived at a time when human beings were starving because of the famine. The human beings were suffering. They did not even have bread. They were dying of the plague. The prioress doesn't care about any of those things. The prioress is so compassionate only to mice and dogs. She had some small dogs whom she fed with roasted meat or milk or white bread at a time when people didn't even have brown bread or anything to eat. Her dogs are being fed with exquisite food. And she wept bitterly if one of her dogs died or someone beat them with a stick. But even if people around her died, she wouldn't mind. And then Chaucer says, her character was all about her conscience. In other words, her lack of conscience. And her tender heart that wept only for animals, not for people. So, Chaucer is actually satirizing the prioress's character. That's again, he goes on waxing eloquent about the appearance of the prioress now. Her headdress, or the headdress of the nun, the wimple, was pleated appropriately. She has taken very great care in pleating her headdress. And he repeats the word full. Full means very. Several times in describing the prioress's appearance. Full, 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 he says, very, very, very. That is also part of satire and humor. Actually, subtly making fun. So, her nose was fine. Chaucer is focusing on her nose. Why? Because the prioress herself is conscious and obsessed with her nose and physical appearance. That is why Chaucer is also focusing on that. Her nose was fine and her eyes grey as glass. That shows not only beauty but also probably duplicity. Her mouth was small, full small. Remember, she is a clergy woman and the narrator is focusing on her mouth that is small. Small means again upper class. Lower class people have big mouth and they have a big voice also. But the prioress is upper class and she has a small mouth. And Chaucer is saying her mouth was soft and red. See, he is focusing on the amorous details of her body. And she had a fine forehead. Actually, prioresses were supposed to wear their veil low on the forehead. They are not supposed to reveal their forehead. And to show the forehead was actually indicative of amorousness or showing beauty. Because what is covered is what is the sexy part. The forehead is covered, usually for prioresses. When she reveals it, that is actually showing her amorous nature. And Chaucer very innocently says, it must be at least 9 inches broad. Well, that's too much. Chaucer is focusing and admiring her forehead. And he says, she was certainly a woman of good size. He is looking at other parts of her body also. And then he says her cloak was very elegant, full fetis. Again, she says at least some 11 times or something he says the word full or very in describing the prioress. Her cloak was very elegant and on her arm she wore a coral with green beads. That is rare. So she is wearing probably an expensive coral from which hung a bright gold brooch. Bright gold. Well, the prioress is not supposed to wear such bright gold ornaments. And on her brooch there is a crowned letter A. That reminds me, in the Scarlet Letter, Hester Prynne also wears the letter A, and it was more like an ornament because it was embroidered beautifully. Our prioress's A is also like an ornament. And it doesn't have any religious meaning. It means amor vincit omnia, or love conquers all. There is a mistake here. Amor vincit omnia. I have corrected it. Or love conquers all. That is not something a prioress is supposed to have on her arm. And the prioress was accompanied by a nun and 3 priests. This nun was her secretary. And why these people are accompanying her is because she is the head of a convent. This is the prioress. Doesn't look very amorous, I should say. Then the monk. The prioress and the monk come one after the other, and the monk is actually like the prioress in his affectation of religion or pretension. There was a fine monk. Chaucer is always like a simpleton. The narrator Chaucer, like a simpleton, is always praising people. There was a fine monk. He was an outrider. That was one kind of monk. There were at least 2 kinds of monks. One kind stayed in the monastery and prayed and read books. They were pale, they didn't have enough exercise, they didn't have good food. But our monk is a man who goes outside and does business. That also shows he doesn't want to stay inside his monastery. He loved hunting. Well, monks are not supposed to do hunting. Venery is the word. Actually, hunting also, or venery, also has a sexual connotation. And Chaucer very innocently says, a manly man. That is why venery, hunting, manly are all coming together. A manly man to be an abbot able. When he suggests sexual activity and then he says he will be an abbot able, that is actually a dig at or a criticism of even abbots. A subtle suggestion. And he had The monk had many fine horses in his stable. He loved full-blooded horses. And when he rode, his bridle clearly jingled in the wind, as loud as the bells of his chapel. That traveling of the monk on his horse, on his fine horse, with jingling bridle, must be one sight. One sight it is, because he appears very majestic. Not at all like monks are supposed to appear at that time. Our monk didn't care for the rules of St. Maurice or St. Benedict, because he considered them old and strict. These are saints whose rules monks at that time were supposed to follow. Our monk cared only for the new customs of modern times. He's quite modern. He doesn't care for all these old rules. He did not give that text, says Chaucer. That text means the text of Maurice or Benedict. He did not give that text the value of a plucked hen. Hey, even though people outside were starving, our monk had a lot of food. And he did not care much for plucked hen. He did not care much for the text also. What did that text say? It said that hunters are not holy men. Our monk does not like that text anyway, because he loved hunting. Because Maurice, Benedict, etc. are saying hunters are not holy men. And that a monk who doesn't follow rules, which our monk does not, a monk who doesn't follow rules is like a fish out of water. That means such a monk will not survive. He will perish. A monk out of his cloister is like a fish out of water. He should stay in his cloister or monastery. And our monk does not like that. Our monk did not consider that text worth an oyster. Plucked hen, oyster, so many foods are mentioned in the context of monk. For some people, Chaucer uses a lot of food imagery as a sign of gluttony or sinfulness or material life or physical pleasures. Food imagery in Canterbury Tales, in Prologue to the Canterbury Tales, is very important. The monk didn't consider the text worth an oyster. And surprisingly, the narrator is agreeing. The narrator is saying, why should he study like a madman in his cloister and work with his hands as Augustine commands? How would that help the world? The narrator is actually supporting the monk in his rebellion against religion. Remember, at this time, rebellion against religion has become common. The Reformation is in the offing. It shows the Reformation spirit. Chaucer agrees with the monk in his rebellion. And he says, let Augustine's work be reserved to him. Whatever Augustine says, let Augustine do. Our monk will not do. The monk was also a good horseman. You know that already. His greyhounds were as swift as birds. His greyhounds were very fast. And he would never refrain or stop himself from tracking and hunting hare. Whenever he found hare, he would kill it. He loved to hunt hare. His sleeves, Chaucer notices, were lined with the finest fur, the finest squirrel fur. And to buckle his hood beneath his chin, to fasten his hood beneath his chin, he had a gold pin. Even iron pins or any other metal pins were rare at that time. That is why the friar carries pins and knives for the wives of his parish. To seduce the wives of his parish, he carries pins for them, because pins were rare. And our monk had a gold pin on the one side. And on the other side, on the other end of his hood, there was a love knot, which is a fashionable knot. The monk's head was bald and shone like glass. That shows his love of pleasure and sinfulness, actually. And his face was also bald and smooth, as if rubbed with oil. It also shows gluttony. Oily face means you have eaten a lot of fatty food. And eating fatty food or being fat also means sinfulness. So, the monk's head was bald and so was his face. He himself was fat and in good condition, means quite healthy, ruddy, unlike the monks of that time. The monk's eyes rolled in his head, showing greed, showing energy, and his eyes shone like a furnace under lead. Lead means cauldron, lead cauldron. His eyes were shining and out of greed or excitement. His boots were supple. Supple means flexible, not rigid. And his horse in good condition. Several times horse is mentioned. Horse is also the sign of energy, athleticness, and a physical life. Horse is also the symbol of a physical life. The monk was certainly a fine prelate or ecclesiastical dignitary, and not pale as tormented ghosts. That is what Chaucer says. The monks of that time who were not corrupt were actually pale like ghosts because they didn't have good food, they didn't have enough exercise. But our monk did not look like that. And the monk loved roast swan. He likes all roast, he eats all roast, any meat he eats. Of all the roasts, he loved fat swan best. Very rare also, fat swan. Chicken is of course more common, but our monk likes the rare meat, swan. And his riding horse, palfrey is the word that Chaucer uses. Chaucer uses different words for horses in the general prologue. Many words he has used for riding horse, cart horse, cavalry horse, etc. And horse is an important motif, like food, in the general prologue. Motifs in general prologue you should take a look at. The monk rode a palfrey and it was as brown as a berry. Brown horse is also indicating energy and masculinity and physical life. You ride a brown horse to the army. It is a white horse is the sign of exquisite, queen-like or king-like excellence. But brown is physical life. Next is the picture of the friar. Then there was a friar. Always Chaucer is introducing his characters like that. Then there was a friar. Then there was a pardoner. Then there was a, like that. One by one. It is also conversational. And he says the friar is a wanton and a merry friar. Those are the words of Chaucer. A wanton and a merry friar. And Chaucer says he is a limiter. Limiter means he has to do his begging. He was of the mendicant order. He has to do his begging in a limited area. Everywhere he doesn't go. And why does he beg? Because that is one profession in the ecclesiastical community. You have to beg means you have to work for the beggars and lepers and very low people in that community and help them to save their souls. Our friar was a limiter and a very serious man, a very solemn man. Chaucer says, in all the 4 orders of friars, there were 4 kinds of friars, and the friars always, whatever order it is, they took the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. None of these virtues our friar had. Poverty, chastity, and obedience. And in all the 4 orders of friars, there is no one who is known for dalliance. Dalliance actually means social activities, and in our case it means flirtation, but it is not as strong a word as flirtation. Friar is known for his dalliance and sweet talk. He pleases people, he makes friends. Ultimately this means flirtation, because what does he say next? Next he says he has got many young women married at his own cost. Why did he get women married? Because probably he got them into trouble. And when these women got pregnant, he married them off to some other men. And having said this, Chaucer says, to his order, he was like a pillar of support. Pillar, the word he uses is post. What does that mean? He is a very lecherous man, And he is like a pillar of support to his order. That means the friar's order is also not so good. It is not so moral. Friars were immoral. His entire order is immoral. That is the suggestion. It is all very subtle. It is not stated clearly. But that suggestion is there. The friar was familiar with and much loved by Franklins. Franklins were the gentry, the newly rich people, the landowners. These newly rich people also loved fun and pleasure. Our Franklin in Canterbury Tales loves pleasure, remember. That is why they are friends with the friar. Our friar is friends with Franklins because all of them love pleasure. And he is also friends with the women of the town. And the friar himself says that he is friends with the women of the town because he had the power of confession. He says that he was very good at taking confessions, even more than a curate, because our friar is very influential and powerful. He has got the license to take confessions. He is the one who has got the license to take confessions, and he shows that, and he says that this is because he is very good at taking confessions, and that is why he is familiar with everyone. Now, Canterbury Tales has a lot to do with power. All these characters are in some way or the other showing power, engaging with power. What are the different ways in which these characters engage with power, and how does it work in that society? That is a very important aspect of Canterbury Tales and its prologue. The friar heard the confessions sweetly and offered absolution pleasantly. Absolution is solution or penance. How to do penance, he will teach the people who are confessing. He heard the confession sweetly. Now, hearing confession itself is a very ambivalent activity. Michel Foucault has talked about it. In the 18th and 19th centuries, taking confessions was a means of controlling people. You get to know their innermost desires and private actions. And through confession, through taking confession, you influence people to change their ways. Suppose somebody is homosexual and he confesses, the priest will change the person's mindset. He will brainwash the person, and talk him out of homosexuality. So, how society mind controlled you through the art or act of confession that Michel Foucault has talked about. The friar listens to confessions very sweetly, and wherever he thought he will get a good donation, there he easily gave penance. Suppose a rich person is giving confession, the friar knows that he will get a good donation from that person, so he will quickly give penance or absolution to that person. Whereas if a poor person with no money is confessing, it will be very difficult for the poor person to get penance or to get absolution, because the friar knows he is not getting donation there, so he will play with the poor man. That is the meaning. So wherever the friar thought he will get a good donation, there he easily gave penance. And then Chaucer says something extra about religion and how bribing is there in religion and how it is wrong. Chaucer gives some general comments on that. Chaucer says, the narrator says, for someone to give money to a begging friar means that he has well shriven or well repented. When somebody gives money to a poor friar, they are thinking, the people who give money are thinking, okay, now I have been absolved of my sins. I don't have to be afraid to give money and buy absolution was the practice in those days. Many men were so hard-hearted, says Chaucer, that they cannot weep or pray. Instead, they gave money to friars. Actually, if you have sinned, what should you do? You should weep out of repentance. You should cry and talk to God and pray to God. Instead of that, many men are so hard-hearted that they can't do it. Instead, what they do is give money. So this is a dig at the practice or institution of charity. Charity is actually easy way out of sinfulness. The friar wore a tippet or like a pocket near his hood, and this pocket was full of knives and pins to give the pretty wives or the pretty women of the parish. He was seducing them in that manner. It is like bribery. And he had a merry voice, and he sang and played on the fiddle. The word that Chaucer uses is wrote. And he won prizes for singing ballads. He has also won prizes. He was a good singer. Chaucer says his neck was as white as a lily. Flower the lies, that is the word Chaucer uses. Neck is white as a lily is an indication of lustfulness. And Chaucer also says, our friar is strong like a champion. He has an athletic body. He has a well-kept, well-built body. But his neck is as white as a lily. That also shows a little effeminacy. It is not a very manly feature. And the friar knew the taverns in every town. And every host and barmaid he knew better than a leper or beggar woman. That shows again his corruption. He knew the taverns, drinking parlors everywhere in every town. And he knew the barmaids and hosts there better than lepers or beggar women. Leper or beggar women have no power. They are powerless people. Why would the friar know them? Whereas hosts and barmaids are powerful people. They serve liquor to all kinds of men. And they have contacts with powerful men, etc. Did you understand? So the friar knew hosts and barmaids rather than lepers or beggar women. Because for such a worthy man as him in his profession, the word Chaucer uses is faculty. For such a worthy man as him in his profession, to have acquaintance with lepers is not respectable. It is not respectable for a friar to have acquaintance with lepers. Actually, the job of a friar in the ecclesiastical community is to be with lepers and beggars and to teach them how to reach God. But our friar does not do his job. And Chaucer says, it may not be profitable for him to deal with poor people than with the rich and the sellers of victuals or food. Everything that the friar does is based on profit. Most of the clergymen and professional classes in Canterbury Tales are oriented to profit. And it may not be profitable for the friar to deal with lepers and beggars. So, whom does he deal with? He deals with the rich people and the sellers of food or provisions. In those days, people are starving. Only the powerful people actually got access to food. And the people who sold food were indeed powerful. Even today, people who sell, it is through food and drink that you can enter a powerful person's heart. In movies and all, you see how, a minister is bribed by giving him food and drink, right? So, sellers of food, friar had contacts with, as well as rich people. The friar dealt with profit. He had an eye on profit. So, wherever there was profit, says our narrator, he was courteous and humble. The friar was very courteous and humble. Lowly, the word again. And there was no man anywhere who was so virtuous like the friar. Again, it is ironic. After showing all his bad features, our narrator is saying, there was no other man like the friar who was so virtuous. He was the best beggar in his convent. House is the word. And he gave a certain fee for his begging rights. In order to get begging rights in his locality, the friar paid bribes. The friar paid authorities money. See how powerful he is, how manipulative he is. None of his brethren could come to his territory to beg. And that means in his territory, the friar controlled his people. He knew everybody and he had access to the powerful people in his territory. That is the meaning. Even if a widow did not have a shoe, so pleasant was the friars in the beginning or in principio. That is the opening of Gospel of St. John and Gospel of John. and the friar would approach the widow, start quoting from the Gospel of St. John, and then Gospel of John, and then he will extract money from the widow. Even if the widow is so poor that she does not have a shoe, she will end up giving money to the friar, because the friar was so clever. Even if a widow did not have a shoe, so pleasant was his in principio, or in the beginning was the word, that the friar will start saying that he would get a farthing from her before he went away. He will extract money from anyone. He was so clever. And Chaucer says his income, word is purchase, was better than his expenses or rent. What he got in purchase was better than what he gave as rent. So he gave less, got more. That is the friar. So that is the friar. Next, the friar had fun also. The word that Chaucer uses is rage. Rage means cavort or jumping up and down. The friar had a lot of fun, like a puppy, as if he were a puppy or whelp. Actually, it indicates disreputable fun. And the friar offered much help on love days. Love days is not days on which you love. Rather, love days is the word for days appointed for settling disputes. When people have a dispute, the friar will immediately go there. He is more interested in other people's affairs, and he will help them settle their disputes. He was not like a cloistered monk in a threadbare cope. He did not, cope is ecclesiastical cloak. The friar did not act like a cloistered monk. Cloistered. Did you see ecclesiastical spelling wrong? Let me correct. Ecclesiastical, correct. Now, the friar was not like a cloistered monk, but he was like a lord or pope. He dressed well and he lived like a lord or pope. His cloak, his short cloak, was like expensive. It was made of wide cloth, double worsted, and it was made with a mold, like a jacket of a suit. When you buy a suit, you get a jacket with it. That jacket has a shape, right? It doesn't lie limp like that. This ecclesiastical cloak that the friar is wearing is also expensive, well made. It was round as a bell, fresh from the clothes press or mold. The cloak of the friar was very perfectly shaped. That means it is expensive. And he lisped with his affectation, because he is pretentious. He lisped. Lisped means speak like this. He lisped in order to make his English sound sweet. Did you understand? He lisped to attract women. And he played the harp. In his harping, when he sang, his eyes twinkled like stars in the frosty night. That means again lustfulness or excitement or energy, like the monk. This worthy friar was called Hubert. Chaucer tells us his name. His name was Hubert. So now we have discussed some of the important characters. More characters remain, but that can be another video.